Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to be talking about Real Life by Brandon Taylor. So of late, I've been a big fan of Brandon Taylor's Twitter account. I've definitely mentioned it in other videos because it seems like everything I've been reading lately, I'm either reading because Brandon Taylor's tweeting about it, or I was reading something else and I just happened to see tweets about the same book while I was reading. He's like exactly the kind of reader that I want to follow online. I feel like my tastes align with Taylor's to a certain degree. I feel like I get a lot out of his Austen tweets and his Edith Wharton tweets, so I highly recommend following Brandon Taylor on Twitter. So it kind of feels to me like anyone who reads the way that Taylor reads is going to be a good writer. So I recently bought this book and his other short story collection that came out more recently. I haven't read that one yet. And yeah, this is a beautifully written novel. I feel like I can see a lot of those influences in it. There is some fairly clear inspiration from Taylor's own biography, but the novel follows a character named Wallace, who's like a biochem grad student who we see being kind of unsatisfied with his life. He's from the deep South. Now he's living in the Midwest going through this program. And he's kind of questioning his place in his social circle, in his career, and just the path he's on in general. And then he is sort of shaken up while he's having these feelings by an unexpected affair with one of his classmates, Miller, who has a lot of his own problems. And Wallace, being a person who's generally very internal and not really opening up to the people around him, is kind of cracked open because of this new relationship. And his past is cracked open as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the language. Just on a language level, it feels so expertly crafted. And I think that's where I see the literary influences the most. I feel like there's a lot of precision in the language choices. You know, even when Wallace is just kind of observing something or there's some sort of description, it's lending a metaphorical, emotional meaning to the scene. So there's lots of like interesting images and good descriptive language, but none of it feels fluffy in any way. Everything kind of serves its purpose. There's always some contribution to the meaning there. And so there's some passages that really stuck out to me that I want to talk a little bit more about. There's one on page 133 where Wallace is talking to his friend Cole, who feels like his relationship is falling apart. The passage starts, "If Vincent leaves me, I don't know what I'll do," he says. "It's the sort of thing you can say only when you're looking away from it, offhand, distracted, the way you might casually notice a piece of furniture. It's the sort of thing you say with a laugh, a soft roll of the shoulders. That's the only way to express the inconsolable grief of it, the fear that begins down in the tripe, in the guts, in the core of who you are and what you want and what you need. It's the truth," and for a moment, Wallace almost turns to comfort him. But he does not. To do so would be to break the spell, to cause Cole to crumple in on himself. His voice is streaked with moisture, a window pane in the rain. That's such a good passage, and kind of the idea of expression of grief comes up in this novel a lot because Wallace is going through something where everyone thinks he should be expressing his grief very differently. But it's like in the sort of understated way that Cole says this, that the most genuine emotion is felt, and it's this very fragile moment where he's sort of like on the verge of breaking. And I love that image at the very end of the passage, his voice being a window pane in the rain. And then just a couple pages later in the same conversation, they move to talking about Wallace's dad, who has passed away just a few weeks before the beginning of this book. And Cole is trying to sympathize with Wallace, but I don't think he really understands how Wallace is feeling, because it's much more complicated than you would assume a father-son relationship would be. So Cole says, "It must be so much to lose your dad. It must be awful." And then Wallace replies, "It's mostly fine," Wallace admits, getting too close to the bone. He doesn't want to go back over the thing about how grief can feel diffuse and dense all at once, like a flock of birds in the sky. He doesn't want to get into it. The diffuse and dense is such a beautiful image in this moment of reflection for Wallace, who kind of avoids thinking about these things a lot of the time. And interesting that it pops up in the middle of this conversation that's mostly about Cole. Yeah, that's just a beautiful bit of language there. Then there's another little example of this kind of thing. This comes after Wallace has revealed some secrets at a dinner party with his friends and kind of blown up the night. And one of his friends, Emma, is coming and kind of scolding him for doing it. And sort of while Wallace is having this conversation, there's this bit about his actions. He takes some of the apple slices for himself. He peels back their slick skins until their white flesh is bare, sees how they begin to oxidize, these naked, tender things. So a big theme for Wallace, who is so internal in a lot of ways, is that he really starts to see the people around him and how broken they all are, and how they just kind of go through the motions and ignore those things. I don't know, it's this moment where he's exposed something in his friend group, and then we have this little metaphor with the apple slices being exposed and tender themselves. So on the language level, this book is really striking to me. There's so many beautiful little moments like that, and it just feels well balanced. This is a pretty packed book. It all takes place in like the course of a weekend, and a lot happens over that weekend. A lot going on between Wallace and Miller. You know, there's all these moments of reflection in there too. The language just feels so soft in a way. I don't know, it's really beautifully written. So one thing that gets talked about a lot in this book is the idea of this grad program that Wallace and all of his friends are in being a kind of extended adolescence. So like they're all in this program, and it's all they talk about, it's all they think about. The lab takes up all of their time, and because of that, they don't have to make decisions. They don't have to like figure out what it looks like when they're out in the world, when they have a real life. It's definitely a relatable feeling when I like think back to my grad school experience. It's like you've got some years that are just sort of a placeholder to do this one thing. You're in this interesting stage of life because a lot of your day-to-day decisions are kind of made for you, even though you're an adult. You know, Wallace is feeling this craving to be outside of it, to be out in that real world, living a real life, whatever that means. Like very early in the book, we're on like page 27, they kind of have the conversation about leaving, which leaving the program so deep in kind of feels unheard of in a way. So it reads, "Yes, he thought about leaving, and yes, he hated it here sometimes, but running through that feeling like hard, resolute bone was something else. It wasn't so much that he wanted to leave graduate school as that he wanted to leave his life. The truth of that feeling fit under his skin like a new, uncomfortable self, and he couldn't get rid of it once he acknowledged it. It was all the same, gray waiting, a fear of not being able to take it all back. He's gone so far down his path, and he's found himself to be a little indifferent to his life, maybe, and, you know, the further he goes, maybe the less options it feels like he has. So like that's like the kind of mindset we're starting off with Wallace in. But the other side of the whole grad school thing, especially in, you know, the sciences that Wallace is in, is that there's stability. You know, there's a certain amount of money that you know is going to go into your bank all the time. You have a place to live, you know what to expect. And that means something very different to Wallace than it does to a lot of his other classmates, because they didn't grow up with nothing. Wallace grew up poor, and so did Miller, so maybe that's kind of the connection between them, that maybe they both feel a little bit like outsiders. But the financial stability that the program offers means a lot to both of them. It's a lifeline. But you know, Wallace is asking himself, what's the cost of this stability that I've been working for? So Wallace feels very disconnected from his life, from the people around him. He feels like he's very different than all of them. He has this tendency to like self-isolate anyways. There's clearly this depression, kind of numbness that Wallace is going through. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but he's also like the only Black person in his whole friend group, his whole community. He just feels very different. And one of the ways that he feels different that was an interesting element to this story is the kind of expectations that people have for what your family relationships are. I mean, it seems like all of his friends assume the normal, have the normal kind of relationships with their parents. Maybe not Miller, but everyone else. They all kind of just think everyone around them has like bread and butter suburban mom and dad somewhere, and that is not the case for Wallace. When it really comes up around the subject of the death of Wallace's father. So Wallace doesn't tell his friends till a few weeks after the fact that his father even died, and Wallace didn't go to the funeral or really publicly grieve in any way. And all of this sounds very strange to his friends. They find it strange that he didn't tell them immediately. They want him to grieve normally or in some way that they can understand and wrap their heads around. So they kind of make these assumptions about what's the correct way to grieve, but they don't really know anything about Wallace's relationship with his father. And there's one scene where one of Wallace's friends is like wanting to comfort him about this, but Wallace can't really find the words to explain how he's feeling because it's so much more complicated than that. And then Wallace like fakes his grief. He puts it into an acceptable shape just to kind of get the conversation over with so he doesn't have to talk about it anymore. Wallace has revealed very little about his life before the grad program to his friends. They don't know his past at all, and they're not assuming that there's significant trauma there. But there is. Wallace's father didn't protect him from someone who repeatedly sexually assaulted Wallace when he was a child. And then when Wallace was a little older, his father abandoned him completely. So, you know, his reaction to his death is not going to follow the expected narratives. So there's this part where he's thinking about his father and he has so much anger towards him and he thinks, he managed not forgiveness, but erasure. They seem so much the same to him. So, I mean, he has these unresolved feelings, and like the only way to get through it, the only way to survive is this idea of erasure, of just not thinking about it, putting it aside. And for a lot of this book, he's putting it aside. So everything that happens with Miller kind of puts some cracks in that erasure that Wallace has built up. You know, he's had to like live his life without thinking about where he came from, because all of it's just so much. He can't move forward. He can't become the person he wants to become with it. So he's just not thinking about it at all. He's just putting it in some other corner of his mind. I mean, it's just like a survival tactic, really. He's got plenty to deal with on the day-to-day. You know, how can he reckon with that past too? A past that is not relatable to any of his friends. So Wallace sees in his professional life, in his friend group, and all of his interactions, how race is affecting everything. I mean, it says early in the book that he's the first Black person in the program in 30 years. I mean, he sees the double standards, the way he's treated differently. And the issue is his friends, they might see that too and recognize and acknowledge it. And a lot of them clearly love Wallace and care about him, but it seems like that's still not enough for them to stick up for Wallace when these aggressions come his way. I mean, over and over again in this book, they're turning their heads away from things that are obviously racist towards Wallace. They just kind of ignore it and hope they don't have to talk about it. You know, in the lab where he works, Wallace is given no passes, no second chances, and it seems like everyone else gets all this leeway, especially this really awful character, Dana, who outright attacks him in a very racist and homophobic way, and there never seem to be any consequences for her compared to Wallace. You know, and I think it's somewhere around there, Wallace is kind of thinking about if it's even worth bringing up, if it's even worth trying to tell someone that someone was being racist towards him. And there's this part where he thinks that white people always trust their own judgment about whether or not something is racist. And they're obviously biased to think things are not racist because that's an easier world to live in. You know, all of that's happening at work, and then amongst his friend group, there's like this guy who's sort of a periphery friend who is openly racist to Wallace at this disastrous dinner party that I mentioned earlier. And none of his friends seem willing to do anything about it. It's kind of what pushes Wallace over the edge, that no one ever speaks up. He's always the one who has to speak up on his own behalf. And then it's his fault for saying that it's a race thing, even though it obviously is. I don't know, you read this book and you definitely get frustrated on Wallace's behalf for sure. So Wallace is frequently throughout this book, multiple times, he is called selfish by other characters. And I think that's just, Wallace is so much in his own head that people perceive him as like not noticing that other people have problems too, which I don't know if that's entirely fair, but you can kind of see Wallace going through a journey in this novel where he sees all of these people in his life have these major problems and things that they're struggling with. And he kind of like opens up to this idea that everyone around him is suffering. Cole is struggling with his relationship with Vincent. He's not getting what he wants from him, and they're fighting all the time. Emma's also fighting with her boyfriend a lot, who doesn't like any of her friends. Bridget, who is an Asian woman, is also dealing with racism in the lab in a different way. Miller has this big chip on his shoulder about the poverty he grew up in and feeling like he had no options and had to work so hard to get where he was, and it was just easy for other people. And he has this angry kind of violent side to him that's all tied up in this feeling of injustice in the world. And these are all people that Wallace considers his friends and should know pretty well, and he's like, it's almost like he's seeing some of these people for the first time. He's understanding them for the first time. Like, there's this moment where at the beginning of the book, he kind of sees Cole as this like puppy dog person, and then he has this moment where he's like, oh, was he like faking his smiles this whole time? And I had no idea. So I don't know, he's kind of like seeing past everyone's external facades, and especially with Miller, they both have these pasts that they've tried to bury, that they've put completely behind them. So Wallace's kind of, this person he is now, is kind of breaking apart over the course of this book. The things that he doesn't think about, that he doesn't talk about, start coming up. And I think the way that this is crafted into the novel is so brilliant. We just see like little glimpses here and there. There's like a little image related to his family, like just little hints throughout the beginning, like the first half of the novel. And as the novel goes on, we get more and more information, and it feels like it's building. This idea of Wallace's past as like this looming thing that's catching up to him. So the book is like building, and then Miller asks Wallace to tell him the story of his life. Something that Wallace has never done, but he's been so close with Miller, so intimate. And it's like this thing that's been building just breaks, and we get the whole story at once. And it's this brilliant little chapter. It's all just one long paragraph, like Wallace is telling us all this without breathing, like it's all just coming out in one flow. I don't know, just brilliant. Like that reveal, that chapter is like worth all the awards. That passage ends with Wallace laying it down, laying his past down so that he can move on. Like when he left, he left that part of himself to die, and he didn't look back. There's this part: you have to let it go if you're going to keep moving, if you're going to survive, because the past doesn't need a future. It has no use for what comes next. The past is greedy, always swallowing you up, always taking. If you don't hold it back, if you don't dam it up, it will spread and take and drown. So again, I mean, that is the passage that reflects kind of what's been happening this whole novel. He's put this thing down, and he's running from it. So let's talk a little bit about the Wallace Miller dynamic. So Wallace has known violence in his life. He has suffered from abuse. And I don't know, maybe because of that, there's something in his instincts. He feels that Miller is maybe not the best path. It's like he can feel that violence coming at certain moments with Miller. And when we get to the end of the book, that violence does come, and Miller hurts Wallace physically and mentally. He injures him. And it almost kind of feels like we're at the beginning of something that could be a cycle of this violent moment, and then Wallace kind of, I don't know, taking care of Miller and doing these things to sort of soothe Miller and make Miller happy, but inside it's like Wallace is indifferent to what's going on in his life. He's shutting down. You know, they both exposed themselves to each other. Miller kind of exposes his dark secret about this violence in him and how far that violence has gone in the past. And, you know, they've exposed themselves to each other. They're very vulnerable. And now it's like scary because the other person has their story. They know this thing about them. So there is all of this tension between them. But on the other side of it, there's so much tenderness between Wallace and Miller, almost like they're trying to heal the wrongs that have happened in their lives with each other. There's this part very early in the book, kind of before the affair itself actually starts, where Miller is like eating nachos and he touches a pepper and gets it in his eye, and Wallace follows him to the bathroom and washes out his eyes with milk. And the passage is so gentle and tender and loving. And I don't know, it's just like looking back on that scene, it felt so beautiful and intimate the first time you read it, but as you get to understand Wallace more and the violence he's experienced, that tenderness seems so much more significant. And there's so much like that in this book between Wallace and Miller, where it's just so gentle. It almost kind of hurts to read. It's heartbreaking in a way. I don't know, their connection to each other, it's very complicated, and it feels sort of tenuous to Wallace. He's terrified of needing someone. And I think Miller probably feels that way too. They don't want to be relying on someone else coming back to them. I don't know, like the moments of cruelty, Wallace has this like wisdom to understand that cruelty comes from people having been treated cruel themselves, but you don't really know how Wallace and Miller can work when you reach the end of this book, especially when you see Wallace in that indifferent, deadened sort of place inside. At the very end of the book, the last thing we see is a return to Wallace's first moments when he arrives in the city and he's starting this program, and he's so hopeful about the friends he's going to make, and he feels like his life begins now. It's really sad to see kind of where he started, because we never see those feelings from Wallace over the course of this novel. You know, it's kind of beaten him down. And you hope that he leaves and he finds something else more fulfilling, but, you know, the novel doesn't give you that explicitly where Wallace is going to end up after this. You know, if we're taking Taylor's actual life experiences and applying them, you know, then Wallace isn't going to stay in biochem. But yeah, I don't know, you hope that he leaves, I think. You hope that he embarks on real life and finds things that makes him feel good. Okay, of course, I highly recommend this novel. It was a beautiful read. There's so much depth. Wallace is such an interesting character in the way that he hides from himself and from everyone. It's a beautiful novel, a little sad, but I would definitely recommend it. Okay, I think that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching. Bye.